The courtroom was tense, every eye fixed on the center where a black woman stood, trembling but defiant. In a shocking display of authority, a police officer stepped forward and slapped her across the face. Gasps filled the room. The judge looked shocked, but before anyone could react, something extraordinary happened. In a move that no one saw coming, she rose from her chair, walked past the stunned officers, and took the judge's seat. Silence fell, followed by whispers of disbelief. Everyone in the room realized they were witnessing more than an act of courage. It was the start of justice flipping upside down. Her name was Mariah Thompson, a 34-year-old legal assistant and community activist. Growing up in a neighborhood plagued by systemic injustice, she had always carried a deep sense of responsibility to stand up for what was right. Today, she was attending a hearing that had initially seemed routine, over a property dispute involving her family's business, but tensions had already been high. Before we continue this story, go ahead and subscribe to our channel and like this video so we can bring you even more amazing stories like this one. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and cold authority. Uniformed officers and attorneys filled the benches, their eyes scanning every movement. Mariah's presence was not accidental. She had spent months researching and preparing, aware that any misstep could be used against her. Yet she remained calm, her hands folded, her mind alert. As the hearing commenced, it quickly became clear that bias was seeping into the proceedings. The presiding judge seemed indifferent, the officers unusually aggressive. Every word Mariah spoke was met with interruptions, sometimes condescending laughter. She had experienced prejudice before, but nothing prepared her for what happened next. When she politely requested to speak on a procedural point, one officer, ostensibly there for security, stepped up and, in an unprovoked act of aggression, slapped her across the face. The impact echoed through the courtroom, and her face burned with humiliation and pain. Gasps and murmurs swept across the room, but the system, seemingly, turned a blind eye. In that moment, Mariah realized something crucial. Waiting for justice from the very system that oppressed her would yield nothing. She needed to act, and she needed to act now. Time seemed to slow. Mariah's heart pounded, but her mind sharpened. Every eye in the courtroom was on her. Shock, confusion, and even fear flickered across the faces of officers and court staff. The officer who had struck her looked triumphant, assuming his authority had silenced her. But Mariah saw an opportunity, a moment where the illusion of power could be dismantled. With measured steps, she approached the bench where the judge sat, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She wasn't just walking, she was reclaiming dignity, asserting authority, and exposing the injustice unfolding in front of everyone. Whispers turned into anxious murmurs, some trying to intervene, but she moved past them effortlessly. Her calm defiance unnerved the courtroom more than anger ever could. Once at the bench, she lifted her hand and rested it where the judge's gavel usually lay. For a heartbeat, silence consumed the room. Cameras, lawyers, officers, and even spectators, all frozen. She was no longer a victim. In that instant, she embodied accountability. She gestured to the officer, whose smug expression faltered as Mariah's unwavering gaze met his. Her actions weren't chaotic or reckless. They were deliberate, a strategic disruption that forced the system to confront its own bias. The room realized that she had effectively paused the proceedings, flipping the power dynamic entirely. Murmurs grew louder as reporters, initially hesitant, began capturing her bold move. The officers tried to assert control, but their commands fell flat against the weight of her composed defiance. At that moment, the essence of her struggle became crystal clear. Justice is not always delivered through rules and procedures. Sometimes it is seized by courage, persistence, and the refusal to accept humiliation. Each second Mariah remained in that seat was a silent protest, a demonstration that dignity cannot be stripped without consequences. By the time the court clerk nervously called for order, it was already too late. Mariah had shifted the narrative. The story of her bravery was now more powerful than any legal argument presented in that room. She was no longer just a black woman slapped in a courtroom. She was a symbol of resistance, an embodiment of the principle that authority derives its legitimacy not from title, but from justice. Climax 9. The tension peaked as Mariah's boldness reached its zenith. The presiding judge, flustered and unsure, watched as she held the seat with a confidence that contradicted the fear in the room. Officers moved closer, trying to assert control, but she did not flinch. Every movement, Every glance was intentional, a calculated assertion of moral authority. The courtroom was electric. Spectators leaned forward, reporters whispered urgently into microphones, and social media was already buzzing with live updates. The officer who had slapped her now hesitated, realizing that his act of aggression had backfired spectacularly. The gavel, once a symbol of top-down power, now seemed irrelevant against the force of her presence. In a powerful, silent confrontation, Mariah leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on the officer. No words were necessary. The room understood the message. She was no longer under the shadow of intimidation. She embodied accountability, and her courage forced every participant to reckon with their own assumptions and biases. Then came the most dramatic moment. The judge, attempting to regain control, stood and approached her. Mariah remained seated, unwavering. With a calm but commanding gesture, she indicated that the hearing could not proceed under the same dynamics. Every word spoken afterward had to acknowledge her presence, her dignity, and the undeniable truth of the incident. The room had become a stage where systemic injustice met human courage, and for the first time, the scales of power felt balanced, if only briefly. After the standoff, the court staff, still reeling from the audacity of her act, allowed her to remain in the judge's seat until a formal motion could be filed. The story exploded across media platforms, sparking debates about racial injustice, police accountability, and systemic bias in the judicial system. Mariah became a symbol of courage and resilience, proving that even in the most oppressive circumstances, one person's refusal to submit can ignite change. Her act did not just challenge the officers present, it challenged a culture that often normalized humiliation and abuse of power. Legal experts weighed in, citing her action as a rare but profound example of moral authority overriding institutional authority. People across the country resonated with her story, sharing their own experiences of injustice and using her example as a rallying point for advocacy and reform. Months later, the officer faced disciplinary action, and the judge issued a public acknowledgement of the incident, an unusual but powerful affirmation of accountability. Mariah, meanwhile, continued her work, now with a platform amplified by courage and viral recognition. Her story remained a reminder that dignity is not conferred by position, but asserted through action. As viewers reflect on her journey, one question lingers. How far would you go to reclaim your dignity when the system itself seems to oppose you? Mariah's story is more than a courtroom drama. It is a lesson in resilience, empowerment, and the undeniable power of standing firm in the face of injustice.